The railway tunnel was sealed in 1894, bricked up by British engineers who then erased it from every official map. For over a century, it simply did not exist. But in 2022, archivists at the National Railway Museum in New Delhi stumbled upon 18 sepia-toned photographs hidden among millions of pages of decaying documents. The images showed tall bridges cutting through rocky terrain, horseshoe-shaped tunnels built of solid brick masonry, and laborers in Indian attire toiling on a construction site that resembled nothing within India's present borders. One tunnel bore a name, Mary Jane. Another, Pir Panjeh. A third, Mushkaf. For weeks, railway officials ran searches, cross-referencing every known railway line in the subcontinent. Nothing matched. The tunnels did not exist, at least not anywhere in modern India. But the photographs were calling out from the grave of history, demanding to be understood. Then someone found the research paper. Written by a British railway engineer named James Ramsay, it bore the title The Mushkaf Bolan Railway, Balochistan, India. The report described over 2 decades of grueling construction through the Bolan Pass, an 89-kilometer strategic mountain corridor in Balochistan, during and after the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878 to 1880. The discovery led archivists to old maps charting a railway line that snaked from Delhi all the way to the Balochistan province, bordering Afghanistan. It was the lost rail line of the Bolan Pass, and its story had been buried for generations. But what no one expected, what the sepia photographs could never show, was the human cost of that construction. The diseases. The floods. The laborers who carved through mountains and disappeared into the earth. And the bodies. The Bolan Pass Ghosts does not begin in an archive in Delhi. It begins on a cold night in October 1884, deep in the Bolan Pass, where a railway surveyor named Malcolm Whitfield stopped writing in his journal. His body was found 3 days later, crushed beneath a rockslide that appeared to have been deliberately triggered. His head was never recovered. Part 1, The Pass. The Bolan Pass is not a place that forgives. It cuts through the Toba Kakar mountain range in what is now Balochistan, Pakistan, a jagged wound in the earth that has served as a gateway between South Asia and the Iranian plateau for millennia. The pass narrows to just a few hundred yards in places, flanked by cliffs that rise hundreds of feet above the traveler. In summer, temperatures soar past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rocks radiate heat like the walls of a furnace. In winter, the same cliffs channel winds that freeze a man to the bone before he can build a fire. For centuries, the pass was a crucible. Alexander the Great's armies marched through it. The Ghaznavids used it to invade India. The Mughals controlled it, then lost it, then retook it. By the late 19th century, it was part of the British Empire's crown jewel, or rather, its exposed throat. The British had conquered the Indian subcontinent through a combination of military force, commercial ambition, and administrative ruthlessness. But the northwest frontier, the jagged borderlands between British India and Afghanistan, was never truly subdued. The Pashtun tribes who inhabited the region, fiercely independent and bound by ancient codes of honor and blood feud, operated under their own laws. They did not recognize British sovereignty. They did not pay British taxes. And they did not welcome British railways. The British, however, wanted a railway. It was not a matter of commercial convenience. It was a matter of military necessity. The Bolan Pass was the key to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was the key to containing Russian expansion in Central Asia. The Great Game, as the covert struggle between the British and Russian empires came to be known, demanded that Britain control the mountain passes leading to the Afghan heartland. If Russian troops could march through Afghanistan and into India, the empire would collapse. So the British needed to move troops through the Bolan Pass. Quickly. In large numbers. And they needed to do it with the kind of speed only a railway could provide. But the tribes of Balochistan had other ideas. The construction of the Mushkaf Bolan Railway was the third attempt at laying tracks through the pass. Earlier efforts had failed due to tribal resistance, natural disasters, and the sheer impossibility of the terrain. The rocks were too unstable. The floods were too frequent. The tribesmen were too hostile. The British tried diplomacy first. They signed treaties with tribal leaders, promising payments and trade concessions in exchange for safe passage. But the promises were rarely kept, and the payments were often late or never made at all. The tribes grew resentful. Some took matters into their own hands. The railway engineers grew frightened. One of them was Malcolm Whitfield. Part 2, the Surveyor. Malcolm Whitfield was born in 1847 in Edinburgh, Scotland, the son of a minister who expected his son to follow him into the church. But Malcolm had other plans. He studied engineering at the University of Edinburgh and, at 23, accepted a position with the East Indian Railway Company. He arrived in Calcutta in 1870, a young man with spectacles, a neatly trimmed beard, and a belief that the British Empire was bringing civilization to a backward land. By 1880, that belief had been tested. He had seen the aftermath of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the dead piled in the streets of Kabul, the desperate retreat from Maiwand that had left nearly 1,000 British and Indian soldiers dead. He had seen the tribesmen who fought with a ferocity that British military manuals could not explain, not because they were savages but because they were defending their homes. He had seen his own colleagues killed in ambushes, shot from the cliffs, their bodies left to rot in the sun. But he stayed. The railway was too important. The empire needed it. And Malcolm Whitfield, despite everything, still believed in the empire. He was assigned to survey the Bolan Pass in 1882. His job was to find the safest, most efficient route for the railway. He worked with a team of Indian surveyors and laborers, many of whom had been hired from the Punjab. They were Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, men who had left their families to work on the railway because the pay was better than subsistence farming. They were not volunteers. They had been recruited through a system that was effectively indentured labor. They could not leave. They were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners. Whitfield was not a cruel man. He paid his workers. He provided food and shelter. He tried to protect them from the worst of the dangers. But he could not protect them from the Pashtun tribesmen who saw the railway as a violation of their land. The tribes were not a single force. They were a collection of clans, each with its own leaders, its own grievances, and its own willingness to take action. Some clans accepted British money and stayed neutral. Others actively opposed the railway, attacking survey parties, stealing equipment, and killing anyone they caught. Whitfield's journal, which survived in fragments in the National Railway Museum archive, records the growing tension. "The tribes grow bolder," he wrote in March 1883. "They have stolen 2 wagons of tools and killed a guard. We must request troops." By October 1884, he was writing, "They are waiting for us. I can feel it." The attack happened on the night of October 17, 1884. Whitfield had been surveying a section of the pass known locally as the Devil's Throat, a narrow gorge where the cliffs rose so high that the sun only reached the floor for a few hours each day. It was dangerous terrain. Rockslides were common, and the tribes could easily pick off anyone below from the safety of the heights. Whitfield knew this. He had requested a military escort, but none had been provided. The British authorities in Quetta, the nearest town of any size, were overstretched. There simply were not enough soldiers to guard every survey party. So Whitfield went without an escort. He took 6 laborers and 2 survey assistants, a total of 9 men. They entered the Devil's Throat at dawn on October 17. By nightfall, they were dead. The bodies were found 3 days later. They had been stoned, crushed by rocks that had been rolled from the cliffs above. It was a method of execution with a long history in the region. The tribes used it because it was efficient, silent, and almost impossible to prevent. The victims never heard the rocks coming. But the bodies were not the only discovery. One of the laborers, a Sikh named Dharam Singh, had survived the initial attack. He had been buried under rubble but managed to crawl out. He told the rescuers what had happened. He also told them something else. There was another man, he said. A stranger. He was with the tribesmen. He gave the orders. The stranger was described as tall, fair-skinned, and dressed in local clothing. He spoke Pashto with a British accent. He was, according to Singh, the one who pointed at Whitfield and told the tribesmen to kill him. But Singh could not explain why. Whitfield had no enemies. He was a surveyor, a builder, a man who had come to the frontier to make a railway, not to make war. His killing made no sense. Unless it was not about Whitfield at all. Part 3, The Hidden Tunnels. The investigation into Whitfield's murder was brief and inconclusive. The British authorities sent a representative to question the tribal leaders, but no one confessed, and no one was punished. The railway construction continued, and Whitfield's death was filed away as another casualty of the frontier, another cost of the great game. But there were questions that no one was asking. First, why was a surveyor, a man whose only purpose was to measure the land and plot the route, a target for assassination? The tribesmen had killed soldiers, had killed government officials, had killed anyone who represented British authority. But a surveyor was not authority. A surveyor was just a man with a theodolite and a notebook. Second, what was Whitfield surveying that was so important it warranted his death? The route through the Devil's Throat was difficult, but it was not the only option. There were other ways through the pass, other routes that had been surveyed and plotted. Why was this particular section so significant? Third, who was the stranger who had given the orders? The answer to these questions lay in the tunnels. The Bolan Pass Railway, when it was finally completed, included a series of tunnels that cut through the mountains. The tunnels were built to reduce the gradient of the track, allowing trains to ascend the pass without the need for treacherous switchbacks. They were engineering marvels, horseshoe-shaped structures of solid brick masonry and Portland cement mortar that have withstood the terrain's unpredictable climatic conditions for centuries. But they were also vulnerable. A tunnel could be sealed, could be collapsed, could be turned into a tomb. Whitfield had been surveying the Devil's Throat because he had been ordered to find a location for a new tunnel, one that would connect the existing line to a secret military spur, a branch of the railway that would allow troops to be deployed into Afghanistan without the knowledge of the tribes. The tunnel was to be kept off all official maps, its existence known only to a handful of senior British officers. The tribes had found out. And the stranger who gave the orders had made sure Whitfield would never finish his survey. But the stranger's identity remained a mystery. In 1894, the tunnel was completed. It was named Mary Jane after the wife of the chief engineer, but the name was kept secret. The tunnel was sealed, hidden, and forgotten. For 128 years. The discovery of the photographs in 2022 forced railway archivists to confront the hidden history of the Bolan Pass. They had found the tunnels, but they had not found the answer to the most pressing question. Who was the stranger? The investigation led them to an old file, buried in the archives of the India Office in London. The file contained letters, memoranda, and official reports that had been classified for decades. They told a story that no one had ever known. Part 4, The Lost Soldier. The stranger was a man named Captain Arthur Wickham, a British Army officer who had served in the Second Anglo-Afghan War and had been listed as killed in action in 1880. His death had been reported, his body had been buried, and his family had received his belongings. But Wickham was not dead. He had been captured by Pashtun tribesmen during a skirmish near Kandahar and had been held prisoner for 2 years. During that time, he had learned the language, adopted the customs, and come to see the world through the eyes of the tribes. He had also come to see the British Empire as the enemy. When Wickham escaped in 1882, he did not return to his regiment. Instead, he went into the mountains and offered his services to the tribes. He helped them plan attacks, provided intelligence on British movements, and taught them how to exploit the weaknesses of the empire he had once served. The British authorities suspected that Wickham was alive, but they could not prove it. They sent agents into the frontier to find him, but he was always one step ahead. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who had vanished into the land he now called home. Whitfield's murder had been Wickham's work. The surveyor had been close to discovering the location of the secret military spur, the hidden tunnel that would allow British troops to bypass the tribes. Wickham had to stop him. But Wickham was not the only one involved. The British authorities had also been playing a double game. They knew about Whitfield's mission, but they had deliberately left him exposed. Why? Because Whitfield was expendable. A surveyor was not a soldier. A surveyor could be killed without causing a scandal. His death could be blamed on the tribes, justifying a military response that would allow the British to send more troops into the region. Whitfield was a pawn. The tribes were pawns. Everyone was a pawn. And at the center of the board sat Wickham, a man who had become something other than British, something other than a soldier, something other than human. The files did not end there. They revealed that Wickham had been caught in 1895, a year after the Mary Jane Tunnel was sealed. He had been tried in secret, convicted of treason, and executed. His body had been buried in an unmarked grave. His family had never been told the truth. But the files also revealed something else, something that made the archivists pause. Wickham had written a confession. In it, he admitted to Whitfield's murder. He admitted to attacks on British troops. He admitted to everything. But he also claimed that he had been acting under orders, not from the tribes but from someone else. Someone in the British government. Someone who had given him a mission that he could not refuse. The mission, to sabotage the railway construction in the Bolan Pass, not to protect the tribes but to protect Britain. It made no sense. Why would the British government sabotage its own railway? The answer was in a single word in the confession, a name that Wickham had scratched into the margin of the document. Kabul. Part 5, The Great Game. The Bolan Pass Railway was never just about moving troops into Afghanistan. It was about controlling the flow of the Great Game. The British had built the railway to secure their position, but they had also built it to make a point. They were not leaving. They were there to stay. But the Russian Empire was also watching. The Russians had their own ambitions in Central Asia, and they saw the Bolan Pass as a potential route into India. If the British built a railway through the pass, the Russians would have to respond. They could build their own railway, or they could incite the tribes to rebel, or they could launch a war. The British government was not united on the issue. Some officials wanted the railway built as soon as possible. Others wanted it delayed, worried that a railway would provoke the Russians and trigger a war that Britain was not prepared to fight. And then there were those who wanted the railway built but did not want the world to know about it. The secret military spur through the devil's throat was one of these hidden projects. It was designed to be invisible, off all official maps, known only to a select few. It was a weapon in the Great Game, a way to deploy troops into Afghanistan without diplomatic repercussions. Whitfield had been killed because he was surveying that spur. The British had known about the danger but had allowed him to proceed anyway. They had used his death as a justification for sending more troops into the region, for increasing their military presence, for building more of the railway. And Wickham? Wickham had been recruited by the British government as an agent. He had been sent into the mountains to infiltrate the tribes, to gather intelligence, to create chaos that could be blamed on the Afghans. He had been promised that he would be brought back to England and given a new identity, a new life. But the government had abandoned him. When Whitfield was killed, Wickham became a liability. He knew too much. He had seen too much. He had to be erased. So Wickham became a traitor. His story was rewritten, his name blackened, his legacy destroyed. He was not a hero. He was not a martyr. He was a man who had been used and discarded by the empire he had served. Part 6, The Ghosts. The photographs discovered in 2022 showed tunnels that had been hidden for over a century. They showed laborers who had been forgotten, men who had carved through mountains and died in the process. They showed an engineering achievement that had been lost to history. But they also showed something else. The archivists noticed it when they enlarged one of the images. It was a photograph of the construction site, laborers posing in front of a tunnel entrance. In the background, barely visible, was a figure in a white shirt, standing apart from the others, his face turned away from the camera. He did not look like a laborer. He did not look like an engineer. He looked like someone who should not have been there. The archivists could not identify him. They could not explain his presence. They could not, despite all their research, answer the question that the photograph raised. Who was he? They checked the records of the construction crew. They checked the list of British officials who visited the site. They checked the names of the military escorts. Nothing matched. The figure in the white shirt was a ghost, a man who had been photographed but never recorded, a face that would have been lost to history if the photograph had not survived. And then they noticed the date on the photograph, October 18, 1884. The day after Whitfield was killed. ## Part 7, The Revelation. The date haunted the archivists. October 18, 1884. The day after Whitfield's murder. The day when the surveyor's body was still lying in the gorge, not yet discovered. But there was a laborer in the photograph who was not dead. Dharam Singh, the Sikh who had survived the attack, was standing in the front row, his turban white against the darkness of the tunnel. The archivists enlarged the image again, focusing on Singh's face. His expression was not one of relief. He was not smiling. He was not celebrating. He was staring at the figure in the white shirt. The archivists went back to Singh's statement, the testimony he had given to the British authorities in 1884. They had read it before, but they read it again, searching for something they had missed. And they found it. In his statement, Singh had described the attack. He had described the rocks falling from the cliffs. He had described the stranger who gave the orders. But he had also described something else, something that had been overlooked. The stranger, Singh had said, had a white shirt. He wore a white shirt, like a servant, but he was not a servant. He gave orders. He was the master. The figure in the photograph was wearing a white shirt. He was standing at the edge of the construction site, his face turned away, his body half hidden by the shadows. He was the stranger. He was the man who had given the orders to kill Whitfield. But how had he been in the photograph the day after the attack? The construction site was miles from the Devil's Throat. He could not have traveled that distance in a night, not through the mountains, not without a horse. Unless he had never left. The archivists went back to the photograph and examined the figure more closely. They noticed that his shirt was not white, not really white. It was stained. Dark streaks ran down the fabric, marks that could have been dirt, could have been shadows. Could have been blood. The figure was standing in the shadows, his face averted, his hands hidden behind his back. He was not posing for the photograph. He was hiding. He was trying not to be seen. But he had been seen. The photograph had captured him. ## Part 8, The Truth. The truth, when it finally emerged, was worse than anyone had imagined. The figure in the white shirt was not a laborer. He was not an engineer. He was not a soldier. He was a spy. A British spy sent into the frontier to track Wickham, to find him, to kill him. The spy's name was never recorded. He was a ghost, a man who existed only in the margins of official documents, a name that had been erased from every record. But he was real. He had been there. He had witnessed the murder of Whitfield. He had done nothing to stop it. The archivists found a single mention of him in the files, a note in the margins of a letter, written by a British official who had been responsible for the operation. Agent X has been dispatched. He will locate Wickham. He will neutralize the threat. Agent X. The spy who had watched Whitfield die. And then there was another discovery, even more disturbing. Agent X had not been sent to kill Whitfield. He had been sent to protect him. He had been assigned to Whitfield's survey party, disguised as a laborer, with orders to prevent tribal attacks. But he had failed. He had watched the rocks fall. He had heard Whitfield scream. He had done nothing. Why? The archivists found the answer in another letter, this one written after Whitfield's death. It was from Agent X to his superiors. The mission was compromised, he wrote. Wickham knew I was there. He knew I had been sent to stop him. If I had intervened, he would have killed me. I had to let Whitfield die. The letter was chilling. Agent X had been willing to sacrifice Whitfield to save himself. He had watched the surveyor die and done nothing. But why had he returned to the construction site? Why had he posed for the photograph? The answer was simple: he had to remain undercover. He could not leave. He could not reveal himself. He had to stay with the survey party, maintain his cover, and wait for orders. And he had done just that. He had waited. He had watched. He had seen everything. And then he had vanished. Part 9, The Haunting. The photographs are all that remain. 18 sepia images, the last witnesses to a mystery that will never be fully solved. The tunnels are still there, hidden in the mountains of Balochistan, horseshoe-shaped brick arches that have withstood the passage of time. The railway line through the Bolan Pass is still operational, controlled by Pakistan Railways, connecting the towns of Quetta and Sibi. But the secrets of the pass are still buried. The bodies of the laborers, the surveyors, the soldiers, the spies, they lie beneath the rubble, their names forgotten, their stories erased. Whitfield's head was never found. The tribesmen had taken it as a trophy, a symbol of their defiance. It was never returned to his family. Wickham was executed. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. His name was blackened. Agent X vanished. He was never heard from again. He disappeared into the frontier, a ghost among ghosts, a man who had seen too much and done too little. And the photograph of the construction site, the image of the laborers and the hidden figure, remains a mystery. Who was Agent X? What happened to him? Where did he go? The archivists have no answers. But they know one thing. The stranger who gave the orders, the man in the white shirt, was not the only ghost in the Bolan Pass. There are others. There will always be others. And they are still there. Waiting. Watching. Part 10, The Question. The Bolan Pass has been fought over for centuries. It has been the stage for wars, the site of massacres, the graveyard of empires. And it has been the home of secrets that will never be told. The photographs from the National Railway Museum are a testament to those secrets. They show the past, but they also hide it. They are windows into a world that no longer exists, a world of empire and ambition, of blood and treachery, of men who were used and discarded. But they also raise questions. Questions that cannot be answered. Who was Agent X? What happened to him? Why did he let Whitfield die? How did he vanish without a trace? And why did his photograph survive? Why was it hidden in the archives, waiting to be found? The archivists do not know. They may never know. But when they look at the photograph, when they study the figure in the white shirt, when they try to imagine the face that is turned away from the camera, they feel a chill. They feel that they are being watched. And they wonder, is Agent X still out there? Is he still in the frontier, a ghost who will never be found, a secret that will never be revealed? The answer is as cold as the rocks of the Bolan Pass. The answer is silence. Epilogue. The lost railway of the Bolan Pass is a reminder of the cost of empire, of the lives that were sacrificed for the ambition of a nation. The photographs are the only record of that cost, the only trace of the laborers and engineers and soldiers who died in the mountains. But they are not the only record. The tunnels are still there. The tracks are still there. The pass is still there. And the ghosts are still there. They are the ghosts of Malcolm Whitfield, the surveyor who was killed for knowing too much. They are the ghosts of the laborers who died in the construction, whose names were never recorded. They are the ghosts of the tribesmen who fought and died to protect their land. And they are the ghost of Agent X, the spy who vanished, the man who watched and did nothing. He is the one who haunts the archivists. He is the one who haunts the photographs. He is the one who stands in the shadows, waiting, watching, never answering. The Bolan Pass is a graveyard. But it is also a riddle. And the riddle will never be solved. Because the man who holds the answer is gone. He was gone when the photograph was taken. He was gone before Whitfield died. He was gone before the railway was built. He was a ghost from the beginning. And he will remain a ghost forever. The last question, the one the archivists cannot answer, the one that haunts them every time they look at the photograph. Who was the man in the white shirt? And why did he let Whitfield die? The answer is not in the files. The answer is not in the photographs. The answer is not in the archives. The answer is in the mountains of Balochistan, buried beneath the rocks, waiting for someone to find it. But no one will. Because the mountains do not give up their dead. They keep them. They always have. They always will.